So in this video, we're going to be talking about American tank destroyer units and the book Tank Killers, which is great if you want to know all about the America's tank destroyers during the Second World War. So early on, even before the war, when America saw what was going on in Europe, they quickly realized they're going to need an anti-tank force. They're going to need some way to deal with these rampaging panzers going all across Europe. And the original when you think of an anti-tank gun, a lot of people, they think of something like a bazooka, a rocket launcher, a javelin, something like that. But most anti-tank guns, originally the idea was essentially just an artillery piece designed to engage tanks. So a direct fire artillery piece rather than an indirect fire artillery piece, which is kind of the traditional way artillery works. Is you don't even see what you're shooting at. It's indirect fire. You get a fire mission, and you go about your business. The famous examples of anti-tank guns during the war was the German 88. That was originally an anti-aircraft gun, and during the Battle of France, I believe it may have been used in Spain as an anti-tank weapon, but I know for sure during the Battle of France, there were German units getting ready to be overrun by a British counterattack, and the German 37 millimeter anti-tank gun just pretty much bounced off. Especially it bounced off the Matilda armor, which was very heavily armored at that point in the war, and so they leveled the 88s towards the tanks and took them out, and it was very effective. The Soviets also, their artillery was dual purpose. So it could be used as conventional artillery. It could also be used in the anti-tank role. So America realized, hey, we're going to need anti-tank weapons to deal with this threat. So there was obviously the traditional direct fire kind of artillery piece. And then there was the idea of making it mobile, because they realized this is probably going to be a mobile war. We're going to need to keep up with these armored formations. These armored units are going to need anti-tank capabilities. And the idea at the time, the doctrine at the time, was that tanks in the U.S. was that tanks were not meant really to engage other tanks. They're meant primarily to engage infantry, to break through enemy lines, to do that sort of thing. Of course, in war, you can't pick and choose who you get to engage. So, but that was the idea. And so these tank units were going to need tank destroyer units. So they needed to be mobile. So we're going to look at some examples here of what was initially thought of, if I ever get to it. Okay. This was one, and to my knowledge, it was not used in the war, but it was the M6 tank destroyer. I believe it's basically just a 37 millimeter. I think that's a 37 millimeter, mounted on the back of a truck. Not very effective. To my knowledge, it was never really used. So the first tank destroyer was the M3. Basically just a half track with a 75 millimeter mounted in the back of it. And this was used quite a lot in North Africa. Another interesting picture right here. Tank destroyer crews were trained to use, as you can see, these sticky bombs, Molotov cocktails, if their vehicle was disabled. I don't really know if that ever happened. I mean, I'm sure it did happen. I don't know how frequently that happened. It was probably pretty rare, because if your vehicle gets knocked out, if you somehow survive, you're probably just going to want to go to the rear and get medical treatment. So then you have so here's some other pictures, the M3 tank destroyer. After that, the idea was, well, hey, why don't we, and here's a good picture of the 3-inch gun anti-tank. So just a direct fire weapon, artillery piece, essentially, designed specifically to knock out tanks. So then the idea was, well, why don't we make it more armored, make the vehicle better protected for the crew. So you have the introduction of the M10 tank destroyer, which was basically the chassis of a Sherman tank, with a 76 millimeter cannon mounted on top. Now, it didn't have a closed turret, so if enemy infantryman got close enough with a grenade, he could just lob it in there. So it was dangerous. You know, if the shell burst overhead, it was dangerous. There was actually a metal kind of flap that they could fold over for protection from that sort of thing, but you know, it was very minimal at best. So you had the M10 tank destroyer with a 76 millimeter gun, which was better, but still had difficulty penetrating the frontal armor of, say, a Tiger or a Panther. So later in the war, they upgraded the M10 to the M36, which is essentially the same vehicle, but just with a 90 millimeter gun. And then they also developed the M18 Hellcat, which was a completely new design, 76 millimeter gun, but it was designed to be very fast, lightly armored, and use its speed and agility kind of as its defense rather than heavier armor. Here's another really good picture of the 3-inch anti-tank gun. So anyway, you kind of see this progression of this anti-tank artillery piece. Then it's mounted onto a truck, then it's mounted to the back of a half-track, then it's mounted onto the back of, or the top of a tank, and it essentially becomes just another tank. It's kind of like a tank specifically designed to kill another tank. And this was actually the argument that General Patton made early on when tank destroyers were being developed. He said they're eventually just going to evolve into another tank, which is essentially what happened. I know that there are people online that get really particular about what is a tank, what isn't a tank, but I feel like you get to a certain point where you're just splitting hairs. So for me, it's the way I would categorize the M10, the M36, the M18. They are tanks specifically designed to knock out other tanks. So that's kind of my review of this book, and not really reviewing the book, but it is really good. I would recommend reading it if you want to know all about the tank destroyer force of America during the Second World War. And those are just my thoughts about tank destroyers, tank killers during the war in the U.S., and thanks for watching.